The desert wind slithered across the asphalt like a tired rattlesnake, hissing through the dust piled on the weathered sign. Black Mesa, Pop, 3142. The town appeared from a distance under the early afternoon sun, small and speckled, a paint stain on the dark plateau. Sarah Caldwell eased off the gas. The old pickup rattled as its tires bumped over potholes, then slowed at the single traffic light on Main Street. The windshield reflected a tired face in a faded blue uniform. Her collar was stiff with salt from long miles, but the brand new badge gleamed too polished, too bright for everything else about her. Sarah touched it lightly with her fingertips, confirming she was still here, then let her hand fall back to the wheel. Across the street, the neon sign above Kenny's Diner sputtered weakly, buzzing like an old man's lungs. An elderly couple in baseball caps sat on the steps, pausing mid-bite when her truck rolled in. The woman's eyes flicked to the badge, then to her husband. Lips pressed together, she whispered something sharp enough to cut. Farther down, kids playing marbles stopped in perfect unison, their glassy eyes reflecting the stranger at the wheel. Sarah killed the engine. The quiet was immediate. Corrugated tin rattling in the wind, a squeaky door hinge, a faint radio forecast from somewhere far away. She opened the door, her boot hitting pavement that smelled of heat and oil. To others, it might smell like decay. To Sarah, it smelled like starting over. She was no stranger to beginnings. The back roads of Texas, Nevada, Arizona had taught her silence. Everywhere, people looked, measured, asked without speaking. Where are you from? What do you carry? How long will you stay? She knew how to breathe through those questions. The sheriff's office door hung crooked, scarred wood, worn smooth by heavy boots. The painted tin star out front no longer shone like a promise, only like a memory bleached by Sunday. Inside, stale coffee, mixed with the scent of paper, left too long in metal cabinets. The air conditioning wheezed. "Caldwell?" a man's voice called before she could get her bearings. "Welcome to Black Mesa." Sheriff Douglas Kane stepped out with a smile wide enough to look friendly, but tight enough not to overcommit. Tall, broad-shouldered, still disciplined in posture, though the gut under his belt hinted at years of diner lunches. White shirt, loose tie, black belt polished to mirror. His handshake was warm, firm, timed exactly like weighing a parcel on a post office scale. "Sir, it's an honor," Sarah said simply. Kane's gaze lingered on the new badge, then locked on her eyes, holding just long enough to press for answers without asking. "We need workers here, not showboats," he said. "Black Mesa's quieter than the city types expect, but the desert isn't kind." "I know," Sarah replied. "Everybody says they know. Then they learn the hard way." He tossed a thin folder onto the counter. "Start with tonight. Patrol North End, El Dorado Wash. Nothing much, some kids spray painting, trash left behind. Consider it a warm-up." The name fell into Sarah's ears like dust into a jar. Barely a sound, but it carried weight. In Afghanistan, she had learned to read dry riverbeds the way others read Morse code. Washes were never empty. "I'll be going alone?" she asked. "For that stretch, yes. Lighter work, no backup traffic. You'll be fine." His grin sharpened. "I hear you were military police. Respect that. But this town runs on its own rhythm, not battlefield tempo." The phrase scraped her ribs. She nodded anyway, took the radio, checked the channel. Kane's office door shut behind him with a clap like punctuation. In the break room, coffee had thickened to tar, but she poured a cup. Bitter heat was better than nothing. Through the glass panel, she caught a glimpse of colleagues. Two bald men with heavy shoulders, a young woman with a wolf tattoo crawling from her sleeve. Quick nods exchanged, a thin veneer of civility. The door swung again. A woman in a navy suit strode in, sharp lines and sharper presence. Shoulder-length brown hair, threaded with silver, eyes scanning like a surveyor. When they landed on Sarah, they paused, evaluating. "Dana Whitaker, state investigator." She flashed her badge. Her voice was flat, polished stone. "I'll be reviewing procedures here for a few days. Don't mind me. I hate being a nuisance, and I hate being bothered. Sarah Caldwell." Sarah's reply was shorter than necessary. "Heading to North Patrol now." Dana nodded, lips curving into something unreadable. Her gaze flicked to the duty roster, stopping on a signature too briefly to be casual. Then she moved on. Sarah pushed the thought aside. She bought 2 donuts and fresh coffee at Kenny's before leaving. The waitress slipped in a packet of brown sugar, murmuring, "For luck." Sarah smiled faintly. Luck had never been her companion, but maybe this town thought differently. By the time she rolled out, shadows stretched long across the highway, the Black Mesa sign casting a sundial over Main Street. Yucca speared the horizon, the road stubbornly straight. She cracked the window, letting sagebrush and rust seep in. El Dorado Wash wasn't marked by a gate, just a broken fence missing one post, a mouth missing a tooth. She parked, stepped out. Silence lay heavy, broken only by crickets and the faint rasp of wind. She radioed in, Unit 11, beginning North Patrol, channel open. Her boots scraped dry ground, dust and pebbles crunching. Faint hoof prints, beer cans crushed into roots, a cigarette butt still warm. Warm meant recent. Recent meant danger. She crouched, snapped a photo, then froze. Metal clinked faintly in the dark. She drew her pistol low. The cottonwood at her back was steady, but her heart swung wider in her chest. A flashlight winked in the distance, then vanished. Not casual, not safe. Sarah whispered into her mic, requesting backup silently, then slid further into the wash. Each breath was calculated. Each step was a decision. At her boot, she found fabric black cloth, stained with gun oil. She tucked it into her pocket. Her gut tightened. Minutes later, she stumbled across branches, arranged to hide something. Beneath them, a wooden crate banded with rusted iron. Army seals faint, but still legible. She didn't open it. She marked it with a scratched stone, covering it back. Evidence. Not tonight. Static crackled. Unit 11. Location? Sarah gave her coordinates. Voice clipped, then froze again. Coyotes glared at her from the shadows, yellow eyes reflecting moonlight, then melted away as if warning her. Her dog tag brushed her chest, cold steel grounding her. Focus. By the time she neared her truck, twilight had collapsed into darkness. That's when she saw it. A new hat dangling from her mirror. Brown, unworn, reeking of oil. She hadn't left it there. Someone had. Every muscle tensed. She scanned the wash. Silence pressed in heavier than sound. She slid into the driver's seat, hand brushing the keys when a massive shadow swept past the windshield. The headlights caught it. A stallion, black as night itself. Scar running pale along its flank, like chalk across darkness. Its eyes glowed amber, unflinching. Sarah froze. The horse snorted, breath fogging through the crack in her window. Not the stench of barns, but dry grass and wild wind. It turned, deliberate, looking past her back into the wash, toward the hidden crate and whatever eyes had been watching her. Then it looked back at her, holding the moment like a question, a choice. Her lips moved before she thought. Midnight. The horse didn't flinch. It simply waited, each step deliberate, pausing as though inviting her to follow. Far behind, on County 7, a single light flickered once and vanished. Back up, or bait? Sarah's hand tightened around the radio. She could retreat to safety, or she could follow the shadow that had just stepped out of legend. Midnight's breath rolled through the night, steady, certain. It lowered its head once, then stepped toward the wash again. Sarah opened her door. The ground was cool now, or maybe she no longer felt the heat. She locked her truck, left the hat on the seat, and followed. The wash stretched ahead, and somewhere in the dark, something metallic clinked again, deliberate, close, too close. Whatever had just fallen wasn't a leaf, and whoever dropped it was waiting. The desert at night was a place of whispers. Every grain of sand seemed to carry a memory. Every gust of wind, a secret. Sarah followed the black stallion deeper into El Dorado Wash, boots sinking softly into powdery soil, her breath sinking with the rhythmic exhale of the animal in front of her. Midnight's shadow loomed enormous, carved against the faint wash of moonlight like a moving monument. She had no reason to follow. Not one her training manuals would condone, anyway. Protocol demanded she wait for backup, secure the site, return to the sheriff's office with coordinates and photos. But something stronger than procedure tugged at her ribs. Midnight wasn't a hallucination. He was real, flesh and muscle and fire, and he had appeared at the exact moment she found evidence that could sink a sheriff. Coincidence? No. Sarah's boots scuffed over rocks, dislodging a pebble that clattered loudly in the stillness. She froze, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Midnight halted too, ears pricking forward, his head turning slowly toward the same direction she had looked. Sarah felt her heart constrict. They had both heard it. The stallion gave a sharp snort and pressed on. They moved past a cluster of mesquite shrubs and into a hollow where the wind died. The air here was heavier, damp with the faint scent of rust and rot. Sarah squatted, brushing her fingers across the dirt. Grooves, not animal tracks, drag marks. Something had been pulled through here recently. The line ran straight into a tangle of branches stacked unnaturally, like someone had tried to camouflage an opening. Her throat dried. She touched her radio. Unit 11 to base. I've located. The line hissed with static. No response. She switched channels, tried again. Nothing. Just dead air. Of course, she muttered under her breath. Black Mesa was notorious for radio dead zones, but the timing gnawed at her. Either she'd walked into a natural pocket, or someone had built interference into this place. She set her jaw. Midnight pawed at the ground, tossing his head toward the stacked branches. Sarah approached, pistol raised low, light angled down. She nudged a branch aside with her boot. Beneath it, a shallow trench led into what looked like a collapsed drainage tunnel, its concrete lip fractured but wide enough for someone to crawl through. The drag marks vanished into its black mouth. Her gut clenched. She knew better than to enter blind. But Midnight's stare burned into her, steady and demanding, as if urging her forward. "I'm not crazy," she whispered, almost to herself. "Just thorough." She crouched, sliding her flashlight beam into the tunnel. The light cut across damp walls, streaked with rust. A faint metallic glimmer flashed back at her shell casings, scattered like breadcrumbs. Her pulse quickened. She ducked inside. The air cooled instantly, carrying the sour tang of mildew. Each step echoed unnaturally loud, ricocheting down the narrow corridor. She bent her head low, the ceiling barely above her shoulders. After a dozen paces, she reached a wider chamber where the ceiling had partially caved. Sunlight must have filtered through during the day, but now it was pitch black. Her flashlight skimmed across jagged rubble, then froze. Bodies, or what was left of them. 2 skeletons slumped against the far wall, boots still laced, denim shredded but intact. Rusted revolvers lay in their laps. Empty eyes stared out from beneath hats, collapsed by time. Beside them, a pile of crates marked with faded military stencils half pried open, revealing rusted cans, boxes of ammunition, and one chest sealed with a thick padlock. Sarah's stomach twisted. The air reeked faintly of oil and something older, something that had lingered too long in this tomb. She crouched, snapping photos, her hand trembling despite herself. Each click of the shutter felt obscene, like stealing secrets from the dead. Then a sound froze her in place, a soft metallic click. Not from her camera, from behind her. She spun, gun raised. A figure blocked the tunnel mouth, silhouetted against the pale wash of moonlight outside. Broad shoulders, hat brim pulled low. In his hand, the unmistakable glint of a shotgun barrel. "Step away," the man said. His voice was gravel, deep and familiar. Sarah's breath caught. Sheriff Kane. Her mind spun. Had he followed her, or had he been here all along? "I said step away," Kane repeated. She raised her chin. "You shouldn't be here, Sheriff." He chuckled, low and bitter. "Neither should you." Sarah's finger tightened on her trigger, but Kane shifted the shotgun slightly, and she knew if she moved first, she'd be shredded before she could fire. Midnight screamed. The stallion's cry ripped through the night like a war horn, echoing down the tunnel, rattling Sarah's bones. Kane flinched, just enough. Sarah lunged sideways, rolling into the rubble as buckshot blasted sparks from the concrete where she'd stood. She scrambled behind a crate, breath ragged, ears ringing. Kane pumped the shotgun, chamber clacking. "Stupid move, Caldwell," he barked. "You think you can outplay me in my own damn desert?" Sarah steadied her pistol, sucking in a breath. Her flashlight beam cut across the chamber. The skeletons leered at her, their hollow sockets like jury eyes. Another blast roared, shattering wood splinters from the crate. She ducked lower. Then a thud, loud, solid, followed by a guttural grunt. Kane cursed. Sarah peeked around the crate. Midnight had charged halfway into the tunnel, teeth bared, hooves striking sparks. Kane stumbled back, shotgun wavering as the stallion reared. Sarah took the chance. She fired. The bullet clipped Kane's shoulder, spinning him sideways. The shotgun clattered to the ground. He staggered, snarled, then bolted toward the tunnel mouth. Sarah lunged after him, but Midnight blocked the path, snorting wildly, eyes blazing gold in the flashlight's beam. The stallion held his ground until Kane disappeared into the night. Only then did he step aside, breath steaming. Sarah lowered her gun slowly, chest heaving. She turned back to the chamber. The locked chest gleamed faintly under her light, padlock scarred but intact. She crouched, running her fingers across the cold metal. Something inside hummed at her, not with sound but with weight. She knew whatever this was, it was worth killing for. Her radio crackled suddenly, shrill in the silence. "Unit 11, respond. Caldwell, do you copy?" Static swallowed the voice. She slapped the receiver. Nothing. Dead again. Her hands trembled as she snapped one last photo of the chest. She couldn't carry it alone, but she couldn't leave it unmarked either. She pulled a marker from her vest, scrawling a crude X on the concrete above the crate. When she crawled back into the open air, the desert had gone utterly still. No crickets, no wind, just midnight, standing like a shadow carved from obsidian, his flanks heaving. She pressed her palm to his warm neck. The stallion shivered but didn't move away. For the first time in years, Sarah felt something anchor her, not duty, not rank, not orders, but connection. She whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Midnight lifted his head suddenly, ears flicking. Then he bolted. "Wait," Sarah hissed, stumbling after him. But the stallion had already vanished into the brush, leaving only the sound of hooves fading into silence. She stood alone, heart pounding, sweat chilling her spine. Behind her, deep inside the tunnel, something creaked. Not wind, not rubble. The padlocked chest, shifting. Sarah survived her first brush with Kane inside the wash, but she now knows two things. Kane is watching her every move, and whatever lies inside that chest is powerful enough to kill four. Midnight saved her once, but vanished as mysteriously as he appeared. The chapter closes with the chest groaning open by some unseen hand or force, leaving the reader with one burning question. What's inside the chest that Sheriff Kane would murder to protect, and why does it feel alive? The desert had a way of holding its breath. After the echoes of Kane's shotgun faded, after Midnight's hooves dissolved into silence, Sarah stood at the wash's edge with every nerve stretched taut. The night pressed in close, as if the entire mesa leaned forward to watch what she would do next. Behind her, deep in the collapsed tunnel, the chest had creaked. The sound replayed in her mind, metallic and deliberate. But when she looked back, the entrance gaped with only darkness, a black throat that swallowed light. She had no proof the noise was real, and yet she had heard it. Her training screamed at her, secure evidence, call for backup, retreat until reinforced. But her instincts, the ones honed overseas, whispered something else. If Kane had risked exposing himself, if he'd walked into that tunnel with a shotgun, then what lay inside the chest was bigger than she could imagine. The hairs on her arms prickled. She turned her back on the darkness. Not tonight. The desert wind returned at last, brushing past her cheeks like a sigh. It carried the faintest trace of sage and something warmer, the scent of horse. She scanned the brush. Midnight stood 30 yards away, flank gleaming with sweat, scar along his side catching moonlight like a lightning bolt etched into flesh. He hadn't left her after all. He had been waiting. Sarah lowered her pistol, holstered it. "Okay," she murmured. "You win." She took a slow step forward, then another. Midnight didn't flinch. His ears flicked, nostrils flaring, but he held his ground. Sarah stopped within arm's reach. The stallion's eyes locked onto hers, amber and unblinking, as though weighing something invisible inside her. She raised a hand. Her palm met hot skin, damp with sweat. Midnight shivered once but didn't pull away. The connection was electric, not violent but deep, like two wires finally completing a circuit. For the first time since setting foot in Black Mesa, Sarah felt tethered not to duty, not to law, but to something older. "You knew," she whispered, stroking the powerful neck. "You knew I'd need you." Midnight tossed his head lightly, mane rippling. Then he turned, nudging her shoulder with his muzzle, before stepping toward the open desert. He glanced back once, waiting. Sarah hesitated only a moment, then she followed. They moved together across the wash. Midnight's stride was long and sure, Sarah's boots sinking in sand but keeping rhythm. The world shrank to the sound of his breathing and the crunch of her steps. Every so often he'd pause, sniff the wind, then change direction. She let him lead. Minutes stretched. They climbed a low ridge where the wash widened into open plain. From here, the lights of Black Mesa twinkled faint in the distance, a small constellation against the dark sea of desert. Sarah stopped, catching her breath, and looked back. The tunnel entrance was gone from sight. Kane was gone too, but her chest still hammered with adrenaline. Midnight snorted, tugging her attention forward. He led her down the ridge toward a cluster of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering even without wind. Beneath them lay an old corral, its posts leaning, rails broken. The ground inside was trampled, fresh hoofprints scattered. Sarah crouched, touching one. Not Midnight's, smaller. Dozens of them. Her pulse quickened. A herd. She looked up sharply. Shadows shifted among the trees. Eyes gleamed pairs, then dozens more. Wild mustangs, silent and watchful, ringed the clearing. Mares, colts, a few young stallions. Their coats caught moonlight in flashes of chestnut, gray, dun, and at their center, towering above, Midnight. Sarah's throat tightened. This was no accident. Midnight hadn't just saved her life. He had brought her here to them. The herd shifted restlessly, hooves thudding soft warnings. But none fled. Midnight stepped closer to Sarah, lowering his head until his scar brushed her arm. His breath rolled over her, warm and steady, she whispered. You want me to see them? It felt absurd talking to a horse, yet the words fit. She stood there for a long time, ringed by wild eyes until her heartbeat slowed. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like an outsider. But the moment shattered with the crack of a branch. The herd bolted, exploding into motion. Dust filled the air. Sarah whipped around, pistol raised. A figure stepped out of the cottonwoods, not Cain taller, leaner, rifle slung across his chest. His hat brim shadowed his face, but his badge glinted faintly in the moonlight. Deputy Mills, he drawled. His voice was steady, almost casual. You're a long way from your patrol route. Sarah's jaw clenched. Sheriff sent me north. Uh-huh. Mills tilted his head. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Funny, I heard gunfire. Care to explain? Sarah kept her pistol lowered but ready. Cain ambushed me. He knows about the wash. Mills chuckled softly. Sheriff Cain doesn't ambush deputies. He rescues them. The words slithered between them like snakes. Sarah's gut twisted. You've picked your side, she said flatly. Mills's smile widened. I've picked survival. He lifted his rifle slightly, not aiming, just a reminder. Midnight stepped between them, ears pinned, muscles rippling. The stallion's warning rumble vibrated through the air. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Mills backed up slowly, fading into the trees. Careful out here, Caldwell. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. He vanished into darkness. Sarah exhaled, shoulders tight. She lowered her gun, running a hand down Midnight's mane. Guess it's just you and me, she murmured. The stallion nudged her once more, then turned his head toward the town lights. Sarah understood. It was time to return. She reached Black Mesa just before dawn. The sheriff's office loomed against the pale sky, its tin star dull. Inside, the air was heavy with stale coffee. Cain wasn't there, of course he wasn't. But Dana Whitaker was, standing at the duty board with arms crossed, eyes sharp. You're late, Dana said. Got lost, Sarah answered. Dana studied her face, then her dust-caked boots, then the faint streak of dried blood at her temple she hadn't realized was there. Lost, Dana repeated, voice dry as sand. She didn't press. Instead, she handed Sarah a sealed evidence bag. Inside lay the black cloth soaked in gun oil that Sarah had pocketed. You dropped this on my desk, Dana said. Care to explain? Sarah's pulse jumped. She hadn't left it there. Someone's sending you a message, Dana continued. Question is, are they warning you or threatening you? Before Sarah could respond, the radio crackled to life. All units, report of shots fired North Ridge, near the old windmill. Dana's eyes flicked to Sarah. That's your sector. Sarah grabbed her gear, heart pounding. Midnight had led her there once already. Now the desert was calling her back. She reached the ridge as the sun cracked the horizon. The windmill loomed crooked against the pink sky, its blades creaking. The air stank of gunpowder. Shell casings glittered in the dirt. Sarah crouched, scanning the ground. Drag marks again, fresh, leading away from the windmill toward another wash. She followed them, every sense burning. At the edge of the wash, she stopped dead. Another crate, identical to the one she'd seen underground, padlocked, half buried in sand. Her stomach dropped. How many more were there? The wind gusted hard, slamming the windmill blades above. The sound was a metallic scream. Sarah flinched, eyes snapping back to the crate. It was open. The padlock dangled broken. Inside, nestled in straw, lay something wrapped in oilcloth. She reached in, peeling back the fabric. A ledger. Old, leather-bound, pages brittle with age. Names, dates, shipments, columns of figures written in Cain's hand. Her heart raced. This was it. Proof. Enough to burn him down. She snapped photos, stuffed the ledger into her pack. A twig snapped behind her. Sarah spun, pistol raised. No one there. Only the wind. But in the dirt near her boot, fresh hoofprints appeared impossibly fresh, as if pressed into the earth by invisible weight. Her breath caught. Midnight's tracks. And they led deeper into the wash, where shadows thickened unnaturally, and the air seemed to hum with something alive. Sarah has uncovered the first solid piece of evidence against Cain, a ledger of weapons shipments hidden in the desert. But she isn't alone. Deputies may be compromised. Cain knows she's on to him, and now Midnight's presence is becoming stranger, almost supernatural. As Chapter 3 closes, she faces a haunting new mystery. Why are fresh hoofprints appearing in front of her when Midnight is nowhere to be seen, and what is waiting in the depths of the wash where those tracks lead? The hoofprints glowed pale in the newborn light, each indentation sharp in the sand as if pressed moments ago. Sarah crouched over them, her breath fogging despite the desert warmth. She touched the nearest track. The edges were clean, moist even, as though the earth had been stamped not minutes but seconds ago. Yet the air was empty. No horse, no sound. Her pulse ticked in her ears. Midnight was flesh and blood. She'd felt his breath, his heat. But these tracks, they felt like echoes. Sarah straightened, scanning the ridge. Nothing but shifting light and the endless creak of the windmill. "Get it together," she muttered. "Focus." The ledger weighed heavy in her pack. That was real. The evidence. Names, shipments. Kane's hands scrawled across the pages. Proof enough to cut through lies. Proof worth killing over. Her radio hissed suddenly, making her flinch. "Unit 11, status?" The voice was clipped, filtered by static. "Dana." Sarah pressed the mic. "I've got something. Evidence. Need to secure." Static swallowed her words. Then, "Copy." "Return to base." The line went dead. She exhaled, forcing her shoulders loose. Return. Simple enough. But the hoofprints nagged, stretching deeper into the wash like breadcrumbs left by an unseen hand. She turned her back on them and started toward her truck. Halfway there, the sound hit her. A low thrum, mechanical, rolling across the desert floor. An engine. She dropped flat, pressing into the dirt. A black SUV crawled along County 7, windows tinted, moving slow, too slow for morning traffic. It stopped near her truck, idled. Then, as if sniffing the air, it rolled forward again and disappeared over the ridge. Sarah's jaw clenched. Kane's men, they were hunting. She waited until the silence settled, then sprinted the last stretch to her pickup. She checked the cab, scanning for tampering. Nothing obvious. Still, her skin prickled as she slid behind the wheel. The drive back to Black Mesa was short but tense. Every bend in the road a potential ambush. She caught herself checking the mirror every 10 seconds, half expecting headlights to bloom behind her. None did. By the time she pulled into the sheriff's lot, dawn had bled into morning. The streets were waking. Diner doors propped open, kids pedaling bikes, old men sipping coffee on benches. Ordinary life, as if the night hadn't happened. Inside the station, the air smelled of scorched coffee and paper dust. Deputies milled about, their chatter low. Some nodded at her, others didn't. Sarah ignored them all and walked straight to Dana's office. The investigator was already there, sleeves rolled, pen tapping against a legal pad. She looked up, sharp-eyed. "You look like hell. Feel worse." Sarah dropped the ledger onto the desk. Dana opened it. Her eyes narrowed as she flipped through pages. Shipments, dates, serial numbers. She tapped a finger against one entry. "This isn't just weapons, explosives too." Sarah's mouth went dry. "This could bury him," Dana continued, "if it's authentic." "It's real," Sarah said, sharper than she meant. Dana studied her, then closed the book. "Authentic or not, it's dangerous. Keep it close. Don't trust anyone." The warning sat heavy between them. The door creaked open. Deputy Mills leaned against the frame, rifle slung casually. "Morning, ladies." Sarah's hand twitched toward her holster. Dana's eyes flicked once, warning her to stay calm. Mills grinned, wolfish. "Sheriff wants Caldwell on patrol again tonight. South Sector this time. Washes are jumpy after last night's fireworks." Sarah held his gaze. "Tell Kane I'm busy." "Not how it works," Mills replied, voice smooth as oil. He tipped his hat and vanished. Silence stretched. Dana muttered, "He's testing you." "He's warning me," Sarah corrected. She left before Dana could argue. That night, the desert exhaled heat as Sarah rolled south in her truck. The sky was a sheet of black velvet pierced with stars, brighter here than anywhere else on Earth. She gripped the wheel tighter, her gut screamed, "Trap." Still, she drove. Because refusing would mean open defiance, and Kane wasn't ready to strike openly yet. He wanted her isolated first. She reached the assigned wash, headlights skimming over mesquite and stone. The engine idled low. Nothing moved. Then, hoofbeats. Her head snapped up. The sound was clear, deliberate, pounding across the sand. She killed the engine, stepped out. The desert swallowed her in silence. No hoofbeats now. Only her own heartbeat hammering. She turned slowly, scanning. Midnight stood on the ridge above, black against starlight, mane whipped by wind. His presence was so sudden, so solid. Sarah almost staggered. "Midnight," she whispered. The stallion tossed his head, snorted. Then he reared, hooves striking air, before landing and bolting down the ridge. "Wait!" Sarah sprinted after him, boots sliding on loose rock. He led her into the wash, deeper and deeper, until the air grew cooler, heavy with damp earth. Sarah's flashlight beam bounced wildly across walls, catching fragments of graffiti, rusted cans, broken crates. Then it caught something else. A man, slumped against the wall. She froze. Blood pooled dark under his shoulder, soaking his uniform. Deputy Young, face pale as chalk. His lips moved. She dropped to her knees, straining to hear. "Kane, set us up." His breath rattled. "Ledger, not the only one." His eyes rolled back. He was gone. Sarah sat back hard, breath shuddering. Another ledger, more evidence. The desert was riddled with it. Behind her, Midnight stamped the ground, ears flicking wildly, his muscles bunched. A warning. Sarah lifted her flashlight. A shadow peeled away from the rocks. Kane. His arm was bandaged crudely, but his eyes burned. He raised a pistol, steady despite the wound. "You just don't quit, do you?" he growled. Sarah's hand hovered near her holster. Midnight moved between them, body tense, scar gleaming like fire. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Sheriff, deputy, horse, all locked in a triangle of violence. Then Kane smiled, slow and venomous. "That ledger you found? Just the tip. You want the rest? Come and get it." He stepped backward into shadow and was gone. Sarah's lungs burned. She holstered her weapon, knelt by the dead deputy once more. His badge gleamed faintly. She closed his eyes, a silent promise in the gesture. Midnight lowered his head beside her, breath warm against her cheek. She pressed her forehead briefly to his scar. "We're in this together now," she whispered. The stallion snorted softly, as if in agreement. Above them, the wind picked up, carrying a sound from deeper in the wash. A metallic clatter. Chains. Sarah's blood ran cold. Sarah now holds undeniable evidence, but also undeniable peril. Kane is bleeding yet unbroken, warning her that the desert hides more secrets, more ledgers, more crates, more bodies. She has seen her first casualty inside the force, proof that Kane's corruption runs deeper than she thought. As the chapter closes, the metallic clatter of chains echoes from deeper inside the wash. Is it another crate of evidence, or something far worse, waiting in the dark? The sound came again, metal striking stone, a dull clatter that echoed unnaturally through the wash. Sarah froze, her flashlight beam jittering across the canyon wall. Midnight's ears pinned, muscles coiling like a spring. Chains. Not the loose rattle of abandoned junk. These were moving, pulled taut, then slackened again. Something alive was attached. Sarah's throat tightened. She raised her pistol and advanced, each step deliberate, boots crunching softly over grit. Midnight shadowed her flank, his breathing heavy, hot mist curling in the cool desert air. The wash narrowed into a natural throat of stone, its walls jagged and damp. Sarah swept her light across graffiti scars, rusted beer cans, cigarette butts. Then the beam caught something that made her chest seize. A man. He was shackled to an iron stake driven deep into the rock, wrists raw, shirt torn. His head lolled, dark hair plastered with sweat. Chains ran from his ankles to another stake, forcing him to sit awkwardly in the dust. Sarah dropped to a knee, gun still raised. "Hey, can you hear me?" The man stirred, groaned. His face lifted enough for her to see bruises purpling along his jaw. His lips cracked. "Water." She holstered her weapon, pulled the canteen from her belt, and tipped it gently to his mouth. He gulped, coughed, then sagged against the rock. "Who did this?" Sarah demanded. His eyes fluttered, unfocused. "Sheriff. Kane. Said I knew too much. Tried to sell. Ledger." He coughed again, spittle dark with blood. "Didn't think he'd bury me here." Sarah's pulse spiked. Another ledger. Another link in the chain. She grabbed at the shackles, tugging. Rusted, but solid. She searched for the lock. A heavy padlock gleamed in the flashlight. "Hold on," she muttered. She drew her knife, jammed it into the gap, prying. Metal screeched. Her hands shook with effort. Midnight shifted behind her, hooves stamping restlessly. The man stirred again. "It's not just ledgers, shipments, tunnels, the mesa itself." His words dissolved into a groan. Sarah's knife slipped. Sparks flew. Then a voice cut through the wash. "Well, isn't this touching?" Sarah spun, gun snapping up. Deputy Mills stepped from the shadows, rifle trained casually at her chest. His grin gleamed in the beam. "Sheriff said you'd sniff around down here," Mills drawled. Guess he was right. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. Midnight bared his teeth, rumbling low. "Easy now," Mills said, wagging the barrel. "No need for drama, just step aside. Sheriff will clean up his mess." He nodded at the shackled man. "And you, Deputy Caldwell, you'll forget you ever saw this." Sarah's jaw locked. "Not happening." Mills sighed. "Didn't think so." He raised the rifle. Midnight screamed. The stallion lunged forward, hooves striking stone. Mills flinched, shot wide, the round sparking harmlessly off rock. Sarah fired back, grazing his arm. He cursed, staggered, then retreated into the shadows, boots pounding. "Coward!" Sarah shouted after him, but her voice echoed uselessly. Mills was gone. Breathing hard, she turned back to the prisoner. He'd slumped forward, blood trickling from his nose. Sarah shoved the knife harder into the padlock, muscles burning. At last the shackle popped, metal clattering to the ground. She freed his wrists, then ankles. He sagged into her arms, dead weight. "Stay with me," she urged. "What tunnels? What mesa?" His lips moved, barely audible. "Under the station." Then his head dropped. Unconscious or worse. Sarah pressed trembling fingers to his throat. A pulse, faint but there. Relief nearly buckled her knees. She hauled him up, slinging his arm across her shoulders. Midnight pressed close, as though shielding them both. "Come on," she whispered, voice ragged. "We're getting you out." The trek back was brutal. Each step dragged sand, each breath rasped. But Sarah kept moving, driven by something hotter than fear. Midnight paced beside her, every so often nudging her forward when her legs faltered. By the time she reached her truck, the horizon was bleeding gold with sunrise. She heaved the man into the back seat, slammed the door, and collapsed against the hood, chest heaving. "Under the station," she whispered. The words gnawed like teeth. Kane wasn't just hiding evidence in the desert. He had buried it under the very heart of Black Mesa. Back at the station, the lot was already filling with patrol cars. Deputies milled about, some sipping coffee, others leaning against bumpers. Sarah's stomach twisted as she carried the half-conscious man inside. Heads turned, conversation stilled. Dana appeared, eyes narrowing. "Who the hell is this?" "Prisoner," Sarah rasped. "Chained in the wash. He says Kane's hiding tunnels under this station." The silence was electric. Some deputies shifted uneasily, others stared flatly. Dana motioned her into her office, slamming the door behind them. "You realize what you've done?" "I saved a witness," Sarah shot back. "You painted a target on your back," Dana countered. Her gaze softened, just barely. "And on mine?" Sarah dropped into a chair, rubbing her face. "He mentioned ledgers, more shipments. If Kane's building tunnels under this place..." A crash outside cut her off. Shouts, the crack of gunfire. Sarah and Dana burst into the hall. Smoke filled the lobby. A grenade had detonated flashbang or worse. Deputies scattered, coughing. Through the haze, black-clad figures stormed in faces, masked, weapons raised. Not official, not lawful. Kane's men. Sarah grabbed Dana, dragging her toward cover. Bullets shredded filing cabinets. The witness lay sprawled where she'd left him, blood streaking his chest. "Get him!" Kane's voice bellowed over the chaos. Midnight's scream split the air. Sarah's heart lurched. She spun toward the shattered front doors. There he was, Midnight, charging through smoke, hooves a storm of fury. He barreled into one of the masked men, hurling him against the wall. Another swung his weapon, but the Stallion reared, striking down with terrifying force. Chaos exploded. Deputies scrambled, some firing, some frozen. Kane himself strode through the smoke, shotgun in hand, face twisted with rage. Sarah fired. Kane dove for cover, pellets blasting plaster. Midnight whirled, mane wild, eyes burning. "Sarah," Dana shouted, "we can't hold this move." Sarah grabbed the witness, hauling him toward the back exit. Midnight cleared a path, scattering men with hooves and muscle. Dana covered them, firing controlled bursts. They burst into the alley, gasping smoke. Sarah shoved the witness into her truck, Dana climbing in behind. Midnight reared once more, then bolted after them as Sarah gunned the engine. Bullets pinged off metal as the truck roared out of the lot, tires screaming. In the rearview mirror, Sarah saw Kane standing in the smoke, shotgun raised, eyes blazing. He didn't fire, he just watched them go, a wolf letting its prey run for now. They drove until the town fell away, dust trailing behind. Sarah pulled off into a dry arroyo, engine idling rough. She cut it, silence slamming down. The witness stirred weakly in the back seat, lips moving. Sarah leaned close. "Ledger," he whispered. "Station, basement, sealed room." His breath rattled, shallow. "You have to find it." His eyes rolled back, still alive, but barely. Sarah sat back, shaking. Dana pressed her palms against the dash, swearing under her breath. "You see what this means?" Dana rasped. "If he's right, Kane's been running this under everyone's noses, and if he knows we know, he'll burn this whole town," Sarah finished. Outside, Midnight pawed the ground, head tossing, as though urging them onward. His scar gleamed pale in the rising sun, a slash of defiance against the darkness closing in. Sarah met his gaze through the windshield. For the first time, she felt not just guided, but commanded. Sarah has rescued a key witness and survived Kane's brazen attack on the station, but the stakes have escalated beyond the desert washes. The evidence now points to a hidden, sealed chamber beneath the sheriff's office itself, where Kane has buried his deepest crimes. As the chapter closes, Sarah stares at midnight through the rising dawn, the stallion pawing the earth as though signaling. Is he leading her toward the hidden chamber under the station, or warning her that Kane is already preparing his final strike? The arroyo baked under late morning sun, its cracked floor glowing like hammered copper. Sarah leaned against the hood of her pickup, wiping sweat from her brow, the taste of grit sharp on her tongue. In the back seat, the shackled man, their fragile witness, drifted in and out of shallow breaths, skin gray, lips blue-tinged. Every exhale sounded like a coin dropped into a well. Dana paced beside the truck, arms crossed, eyes darting up the canyon walls as if expecting Kane's men to crest them at any moment. "We can't stay out here. He needs medical help. Real help. And if we take him to the clinic?" Sarah asked, voice low. Dana froze. They both knew the answer. The clinic was staffed by locals, half of whom owed favors to the sheriff. By the time the witness's wounds were stitched, Kane's men would be waiting with a signed discharge form and a shallow grave. Sarah pressed her palms into the warm metal of the hood. She could still see Kane in the smoke, shotgun raised but unfired, eyes glowing with something worse than rage, patience. He wasn't chasing her. He was waiting, letting her run, the way a hunter lets a wounded animal tire itself before closing the trap. "We patch him ourselves," Sarah said finally. Dana's brow arched. "You a doctor now?" Sarah opened the glove box, pulled out a battered green kit from her military days. "Combat medic training, enough to keep him alive until we find someone we trust." Dana exhaled slowly, tension softening a fraction. She helped drag the witness onto a blanket in the shade of the truck. Sarah cleaned the wound with iodine, the man jerking weakly under her hands. Dana pressed gauze as Sarah stitched, her fingers steady, the old rhythm returning. Needle, pull, knot. The smell of iron and antiseptic mingled in the desert heat. When it was done, the man sagged into unconsciousness again. Sarah tied off the last knot and sat back, sweat dripping down her temples. Dana studied her. "Where'd you learn that?" "Afghanistan," Sarah said quietly. "A farm boy with shrapnel in his leg. We didn't have time to wait for medevac." "And did he live?" Sarah's jaw clenched. "No." Silence settled. The only sound was midnight, cropping dry grass a few yards away, his black coat shimmering. "He's something else, isn't he?" Dana said after a while, nodding toward the stallion. Sarah followed her gaze. Midnight lifted his head, amber eyes fixed on them, ears pricked as if listening to every word. "He found me," Sarah said. "Every time Kane's closed in, he's been there, like he knows." Dana's mouth twisted. "You're starting to sound like the locals. They've got stories about a black stallion that shows up when trouble's near. Protector, omen, whatever. I figured it was whiskey talk." Sarah didn't answer. She just kept watching midnight. The scar along his flank caught the sun, a white slash that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. By late afternoon, clouds built on the horizon, thunder muttering across the mesa. They had to move. Sarah drove them into the Badlands, avoiding main roads. Dana navigated with a county map, marking safe turnoffs with a pen. At dusk, they reached an abandoned cattle barn half collapsed against a dry hill. Rusted barbed wire sagged, tumbleweed piled in corners, perfect forgotten, remote. They carried the witness inside, laying him on hay that smelled faintly of rot. Sarah checked his pulse again, weak but steady. She poured a little water into his mouth. His lips moved, forming words. She leaned close. "Under station," he rasped. "Concrete, room, blueprints, Kane, keeps." His head lolled, slipping back into fevered sleep. Dana scribbled notes, her jaw tight. "If he's right, the sheriff's office is more fortress than station. A tunnel network, storage, maybe worse." Sarah's gut nodded. She pictured deputies she'd nodded to that morning, men and women sipping burnt coffee, shuffling papers while beneath their boots lay hidden rooms, packed with guns, ledgers, chains. A storm cracked outside, rain spattering the tin roof. Midnight wickered softly from the doorway, shaking his mane, eyes glowing in the lightning. Sarah moved to him, resting her hand against his neck. "What are you trying to tell me?" The stallion stamped once, pawing the dirt. His ears swiveled toward town, then back at her. Another flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, the faint glow of Black Mesa against the storm. Her heart thumped. He wanted her to go back. They left at dawn. The witness couldn't travel, so Dana stayed to guard him. Sarah drove back alone, midnight trailing like a shadow. The town was restless. Gossip crackled in the diner, whispers of gunfire, smoke, chaos at the station. Some folks eyed Sarah with suspicion, others with something sharper, fear. When she walked through the station doors, silence fell. Deputies glanced up, then quickly down, shuffling papers, pretending to work. The air stank of bleach. The grenade damage had been scrubbed away overnight. Too clean, too fast. Sheriff Kane stood at the far end of the hall, arm in a sling, eyes cold. "Caldwell," he said, voice even, "heard you stirred up trouble." Sarah met his gaze. "Just doing my job." His smile was razor thin. "See that you keep it that way." He turned into his office, door shutting with a click that echoed like a lock. Sarah's hands curled into fists. That evening, she found Dana waiting in the diner's back booth. Rain tapped the window, neon lights flickering against puddles. Dana slid a folded paper across the table. "Blueprints," she whispered. Sarah unfolded it. The station's layout sprawled across the page, but beneath the main floor, shaded lines revealed a second level. Rooms unlabeled, a stairwell marked sealed. Her breath caught. "He wasn't lying," Dana said. "There are tunnels under the station. We need to see what's down there." "And how do you propose we do that?" "Kane owns this place. Every deputy could be on his payroll." Dana's eyes hardened. "Then we don't ask permission. We go in ourselves." Sarah stared at the blueprint, tracing the hidden stairwell. Midnight shifted restlessly outside, his silhouette visible in the neon glow. Her pulse hammered. This was it, the heart of Kane's empire. That night, they moved like thieves. Dana picked the lock on a side door while Sarah kept watch. Inside, the station was dark, humming with the faint buzz of fluorescent bulbs left running. They slipped down the hall, blueprint in hand, until they reached the supply closet. Dana pushed aside shelves, stacked with bleach and gloves, revealing a seam in the wall. She pried at it with a crowbar. Metal screeched, dust falling. A panel swung open, revealing concrete stairs descending into darkness. Cold air rushed up, smelling of oil and rust. Sarah's chest tightened. She flicked on her flashlight. "After you," Dana murmured. They descended, footsteps echoing. The stairs spiraled down into a corridor lined with cinder block, pipes dripping condensation. The deeper they went, the colder it grew, until their breaths clouded. At the bottom, a steel door waited. Heavy, scarred. A keypad glowed faint red beside it. Dana swore under her breath. "We'll never." The keypad beeped. The light turned green. Sarah froze. The door hissed, swinging inward. Darkness yawned. And from inside, chains rattled. Sarah and Dana have uncovered the hidden stairwell beneath the sheriff's station, confirming the witness's story. But the sealed chamber is no longer sealed. Someone, or something, has opened it from the inside. The chapter closes with the steel door yawning wide and the unmistakable rattle of chains drifting out of the dark, daring them to step through. What waits inside Kane's hidden chamber evidence? Prisoners, or something far worse. The steel door groaned open, air rushing past Sarah's face like the exhale of something buried alive. Her flashlight beam cut through the dark, carving a trembling cone across concrete walls. Dana stood at her shoulder, her own light steady but her jaw tight, as though holding back a curse. Chains clinked faintly in the black. Sarah raised her Glock, stepped inside. The chamber opened into a long, rectangular room, no windows, no vents, just low ceilings dripping condensation. Along one wall, rows of crates stamped with military stencils. On the other, a workbench cluttered with ledger books, loose cash, and boxes of ammunition. And in the far corner, shackles, bolted into the wall, rusted but stained dark in patches that weren't rust. Sarah's stomach clenched. "This isn't just storage," Dana whispered. Sarah moved closer to the workbench. She opened one ledger, her eyes scanning neat columns of dates, quantities, initials, weapons, shipments, cash transfers, bribes, names of deputies, names of politicians. "Jesus," she breathed. "He's been running a private war from right under the town." Dana's jaw tightened. "Now we have proof." She slid her phone out, snapping photo after photo. Sarah did the same, her hands shaking. The sound of boots echoed from above. They froze. The stairwell creaked. Shadows spilled down the wall. "Go!" Sarah hissed. They killed their flashlights, darting behind a stack of crates. The steel door groaned again, shutting with a final clang. Boots hit the floor. 3 men, maybe 4. Their voices low but sharp. Kane says clear it out. Burn everything if you have to. One flicked on a work light, filling the chamber with a harsh yellow glow. Sarah caught Dana's eyes. They didn't need words. Not now. As the men fanned out, Sarah sprang. She slammed her pistol across the nearest skull, his cry smothered by the crack of bone. Dana fired once, a sharp bark that punched another man to the ground. Chaos erupted. Sarah dove behind the crates, bullets sparking off concrete. Dust rained from the ceiling. She returned fire, her shots controlled, dropping one, wounding another. Dana moved with lethal precision, her face lit in strobe flashes of gunfire. Then silence. Bodies sprawled. The smell of cordite and blood thick in the air. Sarah's chest heaved, ears ringing. Dana crouched, checked pulses. "Alive," she muttered. "We'll get statements. Use them against him." Sarah grabbed the ledgers, stuffing them into her pack. Her hands brushed something heavier beneath the bench. She pulled it free, a lockbox. Inside, photographs. Deputies standing with cartel men. Kane shaking hands with smugglers at the border. Proof carved in silver halide. Her throat tightened. This will bury him. By morning, word had spread. State police swarmed the station. For once, Kane's smile faltered as they led him out in cuffs, deputies watching with wide eyes. Some sneered, some looked away. A few almost looked relieved. Sarah stood in the courthouse 2 days later, her ribs bound, her hair pulled back. Midnight waited outside, his black coat gleaming in the desert sun, drawing stares from townsfolk gathered at the steps. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Kane sat at the defense table, his arm still in a sling, but his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. His lawyer, a slick man in a charcoal suit, spoke with polished contempt, painting Sarah as unstable, traumatized, seeing ghosts where none existed. Dana rose, voice like steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence speaks louder than character assassination." She held up photos, ledgers, maps. She called deputies who turned state's witness. She played recordings from the witness they'd saved, his voice faint but damning. "Sheriff Kane runs it all. Drugs, guns, blood. I saw it." Each word was a nail in Kane's coffin. When Sarah took the stand, she felt the weight of the town pressing down. She told them about the ambush, the rope biting her ankle, the betrayal. Her voice cracked once, but she steadied. "He sent me to die because I wouldn't look away. But I won't. Not anymore." The defense sneered. "And the so-called Stallion? What role does this imaginary creature play in your fairy tale?" Sarah's lips curved into the barest smile. "Step outside," she said. Laughter rippled through the room until the bailiff cracked the doors, and the sound of hooves thundered across the courthouse yard. Midnight stood there, vast and terrible, his golden eyes fixed on the chamber. The laughter died like snuffed candles. For the first time, Kane looked unsettled. The verdict came swift. Guilty on conspiracy, racketeering, attempted murder, life without parole. The town exhaled. People clapped Sarah on the back, some with tears, some with apologies for doubting her. Dana leaned close. "You did it." But Sarah shook her head. "No, we did it." Her eyes drifted to the courthouse steps where Midnight still stood, unflinching. That evening, the town gathered outside the old cattle barn, where Midnight had been nursed back to strength. Lanterns glowed, children sat on shoulders, old ranchers leaned on canes. Sarah stood before them, hat in hand, voice steady. "This town almost lost itself to shadows," she said. "We forgot that law isn't just ink on paper, it's the people willing to carry it. I carried it, Dana carried it, but so did he." She turned. Midnight stepped forward, head high, scar glinting. The crowd gasped, some bowing their heads. "Black Mesa has a guardian," Sarah continued. "And it's not just me, it's all of us, him included." The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, a chant rising. "Guardian! Guardian!" Sarah felt her throat tighten. For the first time, she believed it too. Kane is finished, his empire exposed. The town breathes freer. Midnight, once myth, now stands acknowledged as Guardian of Black Mesa. But as the crowd's cheers echo, Midnight lifts his head, ears flicking toward the distant hills. His body stiffens, muscles coiled, eyes burning with a warning no human voice can carry. Sarah follows his gaze into the dark horizon. A storm brews there, silent and vast. Something still waits beyond the mesas. Is Black Mesa truly safe, or has their battle only awakened greater dangers? The dawn after the verdict broke quiet and golden, the desert rinsed clean by night rain. Black Mesa looked different, somehow lighter, as if the very dust had lifted from its shoulders. For the first time in years, the courthouse flag snapped in the wind without a stain of cynicism dragging it down. Sarah Caldwell stood on the courthouse steps, hat in hand, staring out at faces she'd once known only as suspicious silhouettes in doorways. Now they looked back with warmth, some with awe, others with the simple relief of people who could finally breathe. Children whispered about the black stallion they'd seen, the one their grandparents had only told stories about. Midnight stood at the edge of the square, watching silently, his scar catching the morning light. His presence had become more than rumor, more than a shadow on the ridgeline. He was flesh, blood, and bone-proof that some legends chose to walk beside the living. Sarah let out a slow breath. She had survived the ambush, the rope, the betrayal. Cain was gone, shackled like the men he had once commanded. But survival wasn't enough. The town needed something to bind it forward, and so did she. The idea grew over weeks, first in hushed talks with Dana, then in open conversation with the town council. Black Mesa had been burned by secrets. It couldn't afford to hide again. The answer wasn't walls, or more deputies with tired eyes. It was movement, presence. A patrol that carried law into the wide places where darkness once thrived. Mounted patrol. The phrase sounded archaic, like something out of an old dime novel. But the land wasn't made for squad cars. The canyons, arroyos, dry washes, they belonged to hooves more than wheels. And there was Midnight, living proof that the desert had already chosen its guardian. The town voted in the firehouse hall, lanterns swinging overhead. Some scoffed, calling it foolish. Others argued over cost. But when Sarah rose to speak, her voice cracked with more than resolve. You've seen what happens when law is only paper. Cain turned ink into a mask. If you want this town to stay free, we ride for it. Not me alone, us, and not just people. The land has offered us its strength. Are we going to turn away from it? Silence held, then the old rancher Hank Dillard, who had once muttered that she brought the war back with her, stood and removed his hat. If that black horse leads, he said, then so will I. The vote passed. Training began in the yard behind the station, now rebuilt from bullet holes and fire damage. Deputies who stayed loyal to Cain were gone, replaced with fresh recruits, farm kids, ranch hands, even a school teacher who volunteered part-time. Horses were gathered from local stock, some mustangs gentled, others donated by ranchers eager to help rebuild. Sarah rode at the front, her posture rigid but no longer alone in its discipline. Midnight moved beneath her like shadow forged into muscle, every hoofbeat steady as a drum. Keep your heels down, she called to the riders wobbling behind her. Don't grip with your knees, feel the horse. Let them carry you, not fight you. Dana leaned on the fence rail, arms crossed, watching with a half smile. Looks like a start, she murmured. And it was. The patrol took shape, ragged at first, but real. They rode through alleys where deals once passed in shadows, along riverbeds where smugglers hid their caches, across back roads where fear had lingered like a stain. With every circuit, the whispers changed. Not fear anymore. Not suspicion. Something closer to respect. The Guardian of Black Mesa had riders now. Months passed. Cain sat rotting in a state prison, his empire crumbling piece by piece as federal indictments swept through his partners. The town, once brittle with mistrust, found new roots. The diner replaced its cracked neon. The saloon hung a fresh sign, boasting not just whiskey, but music on weekends. Even the sheriff's badge, once a hollow symbol, began to mean something again. Sarah felt the shift in herself, too. Nightmares still came Kandahar, the convoy, Collins's last gasp, but they no longer swallowed her whole. When she woke in sweat, Midnight was often outside her window, silent, steady, eyes burning like embers in the dark. She didn't know if he came because he heard her, or because he too dreamed of battles past. Either way, his presence steadied her. One evening, under a bruised purple sunset, Sarah walked the ridge above town. Midnight grazed nearby, ears flicking at crickets. Dana joined her, a flask in hand. You ever think about leaving? Dana asked. Every day, Sarah admitted. But then I remember where I'd be going. Back to noise, back to forgetting. Out here at least, I'm building something. Dana tipped her head toward Midnight. Not just you, Sarah smiled faintly. Not just me. The mounted patrol's first real test came sooner than anyone wanted. A storm ripped through the mesa one night, lightning striking a fuel depot outside town. Flames roared high, visible for miles. A tanker truck overturned on the road, leaking fire like molten veins. While the volunteer fire crew scrambled, Sarah and her riders mounted up. Midnight led the charge, muscles bunching as he carried her into smoke and chaos. Together, they cleared the road, hauling people from vehicles, forcing panicked cattle back from the flames. When dawn came, scorched earth ringed the depot, but the town stood intact, no lives lost. And for the first time, the people didn't just cheer Sarah, they cheered the riders, they cheered Midnight. The Guardian had become not just one horse, but a covenant between human and wild. Weeks later, the council approved land on the town's edge for a wild horse reserve. Mustangs once driven off were now corralled humanely, gentled, trained to join the patrol if they chose. It wasn't about ownership, it was partnership. Children visited on weekends, sketching the horses, feeding them apples. Old-timers leaned on the fence rails, murmuring about how the town had changed. Sarah stood at the reserve one quiet morning, watching the herd. Midnight lingered apart, always apart, the scar on his flank gleaming like a badge of his own. She wondered if he'd ever truly belong, or if belonging wasn't the point. "Guardian," she whispered. The word felt heavier now, but also truer. He lifted his head, amber eyes catching hers, and in that moment she felt an answer, not in words, but in presence. The dedication ceremony came at sunset. Lanterns lined Main Street. The town gathered as Sarah, in full uniform, mounted Midnight. Dana stood at her side, papers in hand, reading the proclamation. From this day forward, Black Mesa recognizes the mounted patrol, human and equine, sworn to protect the town and its people. May this partnership remind us that freedom requires guardianship, and guardianship requires courage. Applause roared. Midnight pawed the earth, snorting as if answering the vow himself. Sarah leaned forward, whispering into his mane. "Let's go to work." They rode out, the patrol falling in behind, hooves striking rhythm on the desert road. Dust rose in golden clouds, shadows long and braided across the mesa. Townsfolk watched until the riders vanished beyond the ridge, their silhouettes etched against a blood-red horizon. That night, Sarah returned to her small house on the edge of town. Midnight stood in the yard, head lifted toward the dark horizon. She stepped onto the porch, fatigue heavy but her chest lighter than it had been in years. "You did it," she murmured. "We did it." The stallion's ears flicked. He stamped once, then twice, gaze fixed on the far mesas. Sarah followed his line of sight. Out there, beyond the desert's silence, a faint glow pulsed against the night sky. Not fire, not lightning, something steadier, like lanterns strung where no lanterns should be. Her breath caught. "Midnight," she whispered. "What do you see?" The stallion whickered low, mane lifting in the wind, eyes burning with a warning she couldn't yet name. Black Mesa is free. Kane is gone. The mounted patrol rides, with Midnight as its living symbol. The town has healed and begun anew. But as Sarah and Midnight stare into the horizon, the faint glow of unknown fires flickers beyond the mesas, evidence that darkness is never truly gone, only waiting. The story ends not with certainty, but with a lingering question. Has Black Mesa found lasting peace, or only the calm before another storm?